Welcome to Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Carrie Brown, and our guest today is the novelist John Gregory Brown, who also happens to be my husband. So, good morning.
Good morning.
I thought it would be nice if we started with a brief reading from 1,000 Miles from Nowhere, which is your fourth novel and your most recent. Just to contextualize it a little bit for people, it's the story of a man, Henry Garrett, who is fleeing Katrina in New Orleans. He has already, in many ways, laid his life to waste. And when he washes up at a motel in Virginia, he's facing about every kind of unknown a man can face. So maybe you could start by reading from a bit.
Sure. So this is the opening of the novel. In Virginia, 3 days later, Henry Garrett finally saw it all on TV. He stopped at a motel on Route 29, somewhere north of Lynchburg, the dim outline of the Blue Ridge Mountains rising behind the motel's dusty gray brick walls. And the short, round Indian woman behind the counter, her painted fingernails adorned with glitter, took a look at the address Henry had printed on the registration card, pushed back toward him the 3 crumpled $20 bills he placed on the counter, and said, "You will stay here with our compliments, Mr. Garrett. You'll stay as long as you would like to stay. You've lost everything, yes?" "Just tonight," Henry said, "tomorrow." But the woman reached across the counter and touched his arm. Her fingernails, a pale blue beneath the glitter, gently grazed his skin as she took her hand away. "With our compliments, Mr. Garrett," she said, "tonight, tomorrow, as long as you would like to be our guest. We cannot do so much, but this we can do. You've lost everything, yes?" Everything, Henry thought. He considered the word. Had he lost everything? Again, though, the woman didn't wait for Henry. She swept around the counter, confidently hoisted his canvas bag, and led him out the office door, her red and orange sari glowing like a torch in the dim light of the parking lot. The motel appeared to be empty, unoccupied, Henry thought, as if it were foreign land. But she led him down the line of rooms to the last one. 2 windows, front and side, she said, much nicer for you than the others. Inside the room, the woman switched on the light, pointed out the coffee pot on the bathroom's vanity, and turned on the television. "Some company," she said, "but it's like the old ones. I do not know why. It requires a few minutes to warm." The woman reached out then and handed Henry the room key, but he suddenly felt a bit dizzy, dehydrated perhaps, and he dropped the key. When he bent down to retrieve it, he saw that the worn and faded carpet covering the room was printed with an almost invisible purple and black paisley design, and that on her feet, beneath her sari, the woman was wearing gold sandals, her toenails painted the same pale, glittery blue as her fingernails. "Thank you so much," Henry said, standing, a bit off balance. The woman reached toward him, gently touched his arm, but then Henry felt her grip tighten. "Oh," the woman gasped, "oh, oh." Henry followed her eyes to the television. On the screen, a mangy dog stood on a dresser floating in the middle of a flooded street, the houses submerged to the roof lines, the water's surface oily, dappled pink and green. The shot zoomed in so close that Henry could see the dog shaking, struggling to keep its balance on the dresser. Then the images flashed by in a rapid-fire montage of ruin and desperation, a man's body floating face down in the water, his shirt billowing out around him, 2 children hoisted in a yellow bucket from a rooftop to a helicopter, a shirtless old man with a scarred chest and long gray beard squatting on the concrete steps of a house that lay in a heap behind him, a man wading through waist-deep water with a bone-thin old woman cradled in his arms, the woman's hands and feet dangling in the water. "I'm terribly, terribly sorry, Mr. Garrett. You're home, yes. You were raised there?" The woman continued crying. "Everything," she said, "everything."
Thank you. I actually remember listening to that passage, remember Katrina, and remember watching on television, you and I watching on television, those images scrolling by.
Yes, again and again for days and days, sure.
Eventually I want to ask you about New Orleans, but because it figures so prominently in all your novels. But actually I have another question that I'd like to start with instead, which is about how how one comes to understand that one is an artist. So you're one of eight children, all of them professionals of one kind or another, none of them artists at all. Do you have a theory about how you became an artist? What pulled you toward being a writer? Whether that was cultural in some way, that you were picking up cultural signals that somehow your siblings did not pick up, or whether it's something in your DNA? I
don't know. I think maybe I was simply overly sensitive. I mean, I think there's something about the writer that is a kind of oversensitivity, responding to circumstances, the emotional circumstances of one's life in particular ways. And I think some of it is noticing, is kind of noticing, but I think it's also just trying to find a voice. And I think people find their voices in all kinds of different ways. And I think that for me, artistic expression, discovering a love of books and a love of reading and then of writing, kind of forged that path for me. So whether it's a kind of innate sensitivity that you have to the world and you're trying to respond to it and cope with your circumstances, or whether it's just simply an interest that develops, I'm not sure. Can we turn to you to talk about your new book?
We can.
The Stargazer's Sister, because it's also about a family, a figure, a sister and a brother, and about the astronomer William Herschel. It's a historical novel, but you chose, instead of focusing on the central character in the kind of historical drama, you chose to write about his sister, Caroline, who was kind of lived in the shadows of his. Maybe you could read a little and talk about that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, like you, in some ways, this notion of the artist being the one who is sensitive in some particular ways to the world around them. Caroline, who was William Herschel's much younger sister, was, because she was a hidden figure within their quite large family, was also the one on the outside a little bit and attending to the signals around her. But I'll read a little bit from the beginning of The Stargazer's Sister. The wind is with them, and she watches from the ship's rail as the hard places disappear, fortress and stony beach and the long humped quay at Hellevoetsluis, fortress and stony beach and the long humped quay at Hellevoetsluis, the church and bell tower reduced in minutes to dark notches on the horizon. It's Saturday, and the church bells were ringing as they came aboard, not the hour, thus either a wedding or a funeral, she thought, but she cannot hear them anymore. It happened quickly, William taking her hand and helping her into the little vessel which took them out to the packet boat some distance away at anchor. She looks back from the ship's deck now and realizes that for the first time in her life, she is not standing on solid ground. The afternoon is cool for August, shadows of clouds drifting over the land behind them. But as the ship moves farther from shore, a slant of sunlight falls from sky to ground, illuminating the row of painted houses facing the water. Glass in the windows flashes, pricks of light glinting along the vanishing quay in the dark afternoon. She holds tight to the rail. She has dreamed about this departure, longed for it. Now she cannot look away from the glowing scenes shrinking on the horizon, retreating from sight as if being tugged backward toward a void. At last all definition is lost, beach and quay and houses and church and bell tower gone entirely. She can no longer make out the inlets leading into the marshes or the mouth of the river. An egret lifts from somewhere and can be seen for a moment, bright scrap against the tumult of dark clouds. She tries to keep the bird in sight, but finally it too disappears, and then there is only a thin black line on the horizon, barely visible to suggest what they have left behind. When the line vanishes completely, she feels her stomach constrict. She has to remind herself, it is not that the land has slipped off the edge of the planet and into the void, though that is definitely the impression. Her mind knows the land is there, but what she feels is its absence. Bright shifting patterns wrinkle the sea's surface. Far out, floating patches of darkness, giant cloud shadows roam over the water. She turns to find her brother, but William has been absorbed among the passengers gathered at the rail. Spray from a wave lands on her face and hands, startling with its cold, and Lena laughs even as she wipes her eyes. A woman beside her turns and gives her a questioning look. On the post wagon yesterday, the final day of their voyage toward the coast of Holland from the forested slopes surrounding Hanover, her black hat had blown off. The land had been flat and flooded in places with shallow water that reflected the sky, and she'd looked back to see her useless hat floating on a mirrored patch of cloud-strewn blue. A further weight had seemed to leave her. William had closed his book and glanced behind them at the shimmering field. "Your hat," he'd said. "Shall I ask them to stop?" "Oh, no," she'd said, trying not to smile. With every kilometer between herself and the home she left behind, she felt lighter, as if soon she would float up off her seat. William had shaken his head, puzzled, a brother amused by his sister's inexplicable amusement. She had not told him this. Sometimes during the years he had been away from home, she had walked down to the river at the bottom of the orchard. She'd known that if she waded in, perhaps even only as far as her knees, her dress would have become too heavy for her to struggle back up the bank to safety. The current could be powerful, especially with snowmelt in early spring. Illness had weakened her, and she was not strong. She had never learned to swim as her brothers had. A girl was not taught anything she could use to save herself in the larger world. She had frightened herself staring at that river. Finally, she had written to William in England 2 words, "Save me." In a postscript, to maintain her dignity, she had added, "There is no one here with whom to converse any more except the horse, and he has few opinions and a poor vocabulary with which to express them." It had been necessary to make it possible for William to understand her plea as light-hearted. She could not have borne it if he had refused a request made in earnest. Yet he had known. He had understood her. He would not disappoint her. He was sorry it had taken so long, he wrote by reply. He had been making plans. He had not forgotten her.
Lovely. Thank you. Unlike your other books, you've written historical novels before, because the Hatbox Baby has a historical component to it, but this is one that reaches back into a very, very different period. Was that a daunting prospect to write about a world so very, very different from ours?
It was completely daunting, as you know from having written Audubon's Watch. When the farther back you go, the less familiar the world becomes.
Right.
And so the greater the effort to actually reconstruct that fictive world for a reader so that it feels believable. So yes, everything about the world that they lived in, everything that William Herschel and his sister and other scientists and astronomers understood about the universe, I had to try and figure out.
And what are the pleasures of that, given that it is more of an effort?
That it's hard.
It's hard, yeah.
Well, I think one of the pleasures of it really is discovery. You know, you're finding things out.
Right.
And as a writer, I suppose that in many ways, we're engaged all the time in doing that, in finding things out about lives other than our own, places other than our own, or even our own experience or our own place within it. So a lot of the pleasures for me in writing this novel was coming to understand things that I had not known before, but also in coming to see the ways in which, despite the fact that I was separated from them by 200 years, still they were as human as I am today, and there were many of those connections still.
But in contrast to that,
there.
the novel you're working on right now is very much of the moment. It's about a young man who's in this country illegally, working at a kind of New England club for wealthy people, and it's about what happens in his life, and so it's very much feels to me like of the political moment.
Yes.
I know you've been working on it for a little while, but it's taken on a kind of what's your sense about writing in the kind of political moment? Writing, is that different? This is sort of the first time that you've done this.
It is the first time I've done it, and it feels a little bit like you know, walking on a tightrope. First of all, because the novel will eventually have to end, even though it's set in the present. The action of the novel will have to end, and yet current political events, will continue, and none of us, especially now, know what those are. So even though I'm writing a novel which is about a young undocumented worker who is facing, in the context of Trump's election and the political movements swirling around issues of immigration, he's responding to things that are happening now. By the time the novel is published, many things will have taken place.
Right.
And again, none of us know what they are. So I feel as though I'm writing. I'm going to write up to the moment I know to write to, and then it's going to have to stop.
And do you have a sense of what you think the artist's responsibilities are, or opportunities are in regard to that? And kind of when you have a cultural circumstance that feels as volatile as we have today, is it incumbent upon artists to address it, or is it simply one component of the artistic enterprise? How does that feel to you?
Well, I'd like to actually ask you that question as well. You and I have talked about that a little bit. You know, I think there are periods of time, perhaps always, of great political upheaval, or great peril, so plagues, in which art can feel irrelevant. Certainly after 9/11, I think there were many artists asking themselves, what am I doing here? And why is this novel that I'm writing, which has nothing to do with 9/11, because I started it 5 years before, and I can't abandon it now just because 9/11 happened. Those questions, I think, are pressing ones for artists at times of urgent political or global or circumstantial happenings. I think there are some artists who feel powerfully. Chimamanda Adichie, I think, is one of them, for instance, who feel powerfully that it is part of the novelist's obligation to address their political world. I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, I began this novel about this young undocumented worker, not out of political motivation, but out of curiosity about the ways in which the 1%, so the people at this country club where this young guy works, and somebody who's completely disenfranchised rub up against one another. I was interested in that human angle. Of course, it became, over the 2 years that I've been working on the novel, it became a novel of political urgency, a novel of political crisis. But I guess I would put that back. I would send that question back to you. Do you think the artist has a moral obligation to be political?
I don't know that it's a moral obligation. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that often, perhaps in the nature of its length, that I've found that poets are responding very forcefully, vocally, and that's a form that, because of its brevity, that can be produced in a short period of time and put out there into the world in a way that, if you're a novelist, I mean, when I began the Katrina novel, Katrina had not been that far away, and by the time I was done with it, it was much later.
Yeah.
And there's some value to that, I think, too, in the ways in which social circumstances, political circumstances simmer and then get processed through a kind of artistic response. We get the kind of response of the media and journalism, et cetera, to a circumstance. And then what the artist does is finds a particular view, particular individual view and response, and it becomes both a kind of response to it, but a documenting of what has come before. So it has a kind of value that it is, in a way,
becomes
a
archival.
Preservation. Right. It becomes a preservation of the moment. And so that's what I think is interesting, is that I think different artists, whether it's visual artists, composers, writers, are responding in different ways in different media that require a different level of absorption, a level of kind of simmering, I don't know what else to call it, so that I think that inevitably we are of our time, but different artists will address it in very, very different ways. I mean, it still leaves open the question of writing about whether a historical period or something that unrelated to what's happening in the world, what the place of that art is in. You know, everybody talks about how Jane Austen, all these wars were going on, and Jane Austen was writing these things, and so
these domestic dramas.
Right, and so you've got the sense that those matter, but how are they affected by the context? Anyway, I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the answer is to it, but I think, I mean, the wonderful things about art is that it has a multiplicity to it, so that you have different artists doing all kinds of different things.
Yeah, and there's also that, you know, that question of novels which continue to be resonant for us, no matter what's taking place in the world. So one of my favorite novels is A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr, which is set in the wake of the Second World War in England in a tiny English village. It is very much a novel about war. And yet it's very far removed in terms of time and place, and even its concerns, actually, from what we might think of as war today. War today is a completely different phenomenon than war as they understood it and experienced it in the Second World War.
Right.
I want to ask you, you and I have talked a little bit about this. I want to ask you something about, and this veers away from what we've been talking about your process as a writer and what you're thinking of. I've compared your work to music and mine to painting, that you're very aware of sound as a writer. You love music of all kinds. You're very knowledgeable about it. Every time we get into an Uber, you want to talk to the driver about where that driver's from and the music of that place, and you're always mentioning musicians, and you can have these long conversations with them. Is there a way in which, when you are writing, you are actively thinking about sound?
Yes.
As opposed to image.
Well, but the because the vehicle is words, and the vehicle is not sound. You have to kind of create images, but there is a kind of rhythm to the language itself. So I care a lot about it. I don't really quite understand it. I know that the writers I've loved are the writers who have a distinct lyricism quality to their work. I think it began when I first read Faulkner when I was young and listened to the music of that. A lot of the Southern writers I love have a kind of lyricism to their work that I've modeled my writing after. So it's true, I love music. I don't know whether I'm knowledgeable, but I love it. I'm a kind of omnivore about it. I love all different kinds of music. And so I do think about and I do attend to the language, the rhythm, the beauty of the language. I care a great deal about that. It's interesting because I also care a great deal about the internal life. I mean, it's you are so much more accomplished. I mean, I make a joke about it, saying that my characters never go outside or eat anything because I don't really know how to describe the natural world in the ways in which you do, or the kind of all the meals that people eat, etc. And so it's true that I attend to internal life, the internal life of my characters much more fully. It's a kind of absorption inside of them, rather than you write about characters going out into the world and encountering others and circumstances, and my novels have a tendency to be much more about the kind of inner workings of that tension
characters between the interior and the exterior world that is present in every work of fiction is there.
And we have a different aesthetic as well. I mean, I used to joke that my novels are about things falling apart and yours are about things coming back together again. And that's the kind of story that, can you talk about that? What interests you about, I know you've written an essay called The Art of Happiness, and thinking about joy and the way the pleasures of that, which in literature is often an overlooked component of, and maybe not even absent from a lot of my work.
It's interesting to think about the problem of writing about happiness, moments of happiness, because we tend to think of fiction as capturing conflict, capturing drama, because otherwise what you have is a flat line. You have nothing happening. If everybody's okay, there's no story there. And yet I have always felt that trying to write about those moments in a character's life when they are experiencing great relief, when they are experiencing great love, when they're experiencing great joy, whether that is the pleasure of eating, or it's the pleasure of being in the natural world, or it's the pleasure of sex, or whatever that pleasure is, that those, it feels to me necessary that those be present in any story, because that feels true to me about human life, that it is not, we hope, one hopes for most people, it is not a uniformly miserable state, and that actually those spikes or those moments or those valleys of happiness that appear help actually to create further drama, because then then we can be afraid of the characters losing them.
Right.
And then we know that they won't last.
Right.
And it's by their very nature of being ephemeral that they become important dramatic devices in a story. So I like trying to write about them. I think they're hard to write about. Marilyn Robinson does a beautiful job, I think, of managing to write within stories that are deeply grave and profound and contain great depths of human sadness. These moments of great felicity and even humor.
And that's the idea of literature as affirmation somehow, of affirmation of the value of the human experience, the possibility of transcendence, the possibility to kind of rise above the life's complications and challenges.
Yeah. Can we talk for a minute about process? Because
Sure.
Because I think lots of people are interested in how writers do what they do, and often it's really interesting how writers do what they do. You do a lot of what you call thinking. What's actually happening there when
it's a good question.
When you are thinking?
Yeah, I'm a painfully slow writer. It's something I've had to come to accept. One of the things about being a novelist is it takes so long to do what you do, and so it's true that I do spend a lot of time what feels like absorbing. I mean, it feels a bit like a sponge. You have the kind of idea for a novel, and then you take in your ideas about character, about.
But how are you taking it in? I mean, are you making notes? Are you listening to music? Are you reading stuff?
All of those things. Yeah, it's reading. I mean, I remember, I think it was Annie Proulx who said something about buying books that she knew she would never read. That it's this process of gathering around you all kinds of material that you don't know what's useful. You don't know because you're not moving in a straight line. It's not like historical research where I need to find out this and I need to find out that. It is a process of having various things. So with what I'm working on now, I'm thinking about this painter Wilhelm Hammershøi. I'm thinking about Rilke. I'm thinking about various historical figures, Schubert's music, all these things. But I'm also thinking about Elvis Presley and this photographer, Winston Link, who was a kind of photographer of trains. So all of these things, you're pulling it all together, trying to find your story, and that becomes you absorb all that, and then somehow you make your way forward out of that.
Out of the soup.
Yes, but the interesting thing for you is that your process seems vastly different from that. And I'm wondering, you were a journalist for 12 years, and I'm wondering if that work as a journalist, of sitting in the chair and getting a story and getting it out quickly, if that feels as though it's useful in what you do now as a novelist, or any other components of being a journalist.
Well, being a journalist was certainly useful for me in helping me to understand what a story was. Somehow I managed to get a college education and read a lot of novels without really, I think, internalizing what a story was. Actually having to write stories as a journalist, I think, helped me understand narrative shape and design in a way that my professors I had failed to apprehend what they meant. But as different as we are as writers, we've been able to maintain this wonderful conversation throughout our long marriage about books we love,
yes,
about our own books, about lots of other writers' words as well, and hopefully we'll continue to do that for a long time. So we're at the end of our conversation now. So thank you for joining us today on this edition of Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life.